My name is Luiza Bialasiewicz, and I'm Professor of European Governance in the Department of European Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm the co-director of ACES, the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. On behalf of ACES, I would like to welcome you to this, which is the first in a series of events that we're co-organizing with SPOW25 in partnership with them. And I'd like to thank SPOW very much, and Jeske Brouwer especially, for helping make this happen. You will find actually on their website and on the website of ACES the details of the full series of events, which will begin next Wednesday in a weekly fashion that we have called the Virtual Visions of Europe series, talking about the very different aspects of the effects of the COVID pandemic on politics, on geopolitics, on notions of solidarity, on economic questions. So we're very fortunate today to have an exceptional speaker to kick off the series of events, someone who is certainly uniquely positioned to discuss with us the future of Europe and the future of the transatlantic partnership in what are, to, let's say, put mildly, turbulent times. Ambassador Anthony Luiza Gardner. I thought I'd cite to you the words of Matt Kamiński, who is the chief editor of Politico, who described Ambassador Gardner in these terms. He said, "It's hard to think of anyone on either side of the Atlantic who knows the Europe of today better than Tony Gardner." Anthony Gardner served as the ambassador of the United States to the European Union from 2014 to 2017, and he was previously Director of European Affairs at the National Security Council from 1994 to 1995. But these postings actually speak to only part of what is an extensive experience that spanned several decades of service to US European affairs as a diplomat, as a lawyer, and as an investor. During his posting as President Barack Obama's ambassador to the EU, he was one of the chief people responsible for the negotiations of the TTIP, and he describes these very well in the book that he's going to be talking to us about tonight. But although his role in the trade negotiations was perhaps most visible, I think Ambassador Gardner also left a very profound mark on the emergence of the EU's geopolitical persona as well in those turning point years, as one of the most vocal supporters of a stronger EU role in the world. I first met Ambassador Gardner actually at the celebrations for the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome in 2017, and I was very struck by the forceful arguments that he was making in the talk that he gave there for a stronger Europe. Arguments that, to my mind, were much more perceptive and certainly kind of arguing for a stronger European role, much more so than some of the European leaders assembled there. This evening, Ambassador Gardner will discuss with us his just released book with a wonderful title, Stars with Stripes, the Essential Partnership between the European Union and the United States. And I think in a moment when incendiary and isolationist geopolitical rhetoric has become a daily staple in the Trump repertoire, I believe we need more than ever, one, to understand how the EU and the US can maintain a relationship, can remain valuable partners and allies, and I think we also need a ray of optimism in these dark times. Before I turn over the floor to Ambassador Gardner, I would like to introduce the structure of tonight's evening and also our discussant, because we are extremely pleased, in fact, to have with us Matthijs van der Plas, who is the Director General for Political Affairs at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and until last year, the Ministry as Director for European Cooperation, so somebody who is uniquely placed to comment on Ambassador Gardner's book. Thijs is also a long-serving diplomat with the ministry. He has held posts at the Dutch embassies in Ankara and Sofia, and also the permanent representation of the Netherlands to the EU. And we'd very much like to thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for the discussion tonight. So we will begin with a discussion, a short presentation of Ambassador Gardner's book, And then we will follow this with a discussion led by Thijs and myself, also incorporating some questions that those of you from home have sent to us in advance. So without further ado, Ambassador Gardner, I would like to give the floor to you.
Thank you so much for organizing this, and I will try to be brief because discussions tend to be more interesting. I hope everyone is safe at home for all, and that your families are safe and keeping positive despite the difficult circumstances we're facing. Luiza, thank you for underlining also my European heritage, because I feel very strongly about it. You know, my grandparents fled Italy, as you know, but returned to Italy after the war to help in reconstruction. It's very much part of my life. I spent several years growing up as a kid in Rome, with a home in Venice, 29 years of my life in Europe, 22 years in the UK, 5 years in Belgium. Unfortunately, never lived in Amsterdam. I'm sorry to say, I wish I had. Lived in Germany, and my wife is Spanish and so forth. So Europe is a really important part of my life, and I hope that it shows in this book, because for me, my job wasn't just professional, it was personal. So why did I write the book? I left on January 2017. Donald Trump asked all ambassadors from the prior administration to leave on that date, which was unusual. But okay, because I left and I went to teach at the College of Europe in Bruges, and I had a wonderful time. 3 months of fascinating, ambitious, smart students. But I thought to myself, things are going to get bad. A lot of what we had been building during the Obama years, and frankly, even for 60 years of bipartisan foreign policy toward Europe and toward European integration, much of that is going to be undone. And I was worried, and I thought to myself, somebody should actually describe in a non-academic way what it is that the United States and the European Union do together and why is it important. But I realized, Luiza, this is a tough job because the European Union is a difficult animal to describe, even to Europeans in Europe, let alone to an American audience. And I was reminded of something that Thomas Friedman, the famous journalist, said. He said that putting the words European Union in the title of an article is a surefire guarantee of putting people asleep, making people fall asleep. And it says, well, this is going to be a tough job. My daughter, then 15 years old, told me, Daddy, don't write this book. It's going to be boring. No one's going to read it. You should focus on making money to pay school fees. But I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to write this book because at some point there should be a record of what we do together. So in quickly, what is this book? It describes in 9 areas, divided into 3 different buckets, sectors, what we've done together. The first is obviously economic, which is the most important, clearly. So it's trade. How did we negotiate, try to negotiate a transatlantic free trade agreement? We didn't get there, but we got a lot done. I described that. Data privacy. I described the tensions that we suffered and what we did in putting together an important agreement called Privacy Shield to ensure the flow of data, personal data from Europe to the United States. I described the digital economy, hugely important, and how we cooperated on large parts of the EU agenda, the digital single market. And then I described the security agenda, very important as well. Sanctions, which I lived through during the sanctions crisis after the Russian invasion, annexation of Crimea. Law enforcement, military and security cooperation, which, by the way, many people are surprised to hear that the US and the EU actually do have a rather interesting cooperation in this field. I say surprised because many people do believe correctly that the EU is not exactly military power and has a rather modest footprint in the security sphere, but we do cooperate very well. And on law enforcement, people are often surprised to hear that the United States has 14 full-time agents at Europol in The Hague who are very actively working together with that hugely important institution on a wide range of law enforcement and serious crime issues, and counterterrorism, by the way. And I also describe, as I say, energy security, So that's the bulk of the security chapter. Then the final bucket is saving the planet, as I call it, which is climate change, how we got to the Paris Climate Accords together. And I describe a bit of history there to remind people that, we had 8 years under Obama where finally the US and the EU were more or less aligned on what we needed to do to get to an agreement. And I say, more or less, but over history, we were in disalignment. In the 70s, the United States was actually more active on the environmental front. The EU then took leadership for a long period of time. During the dark days in the Bush administration, we withdrew from Kyoto and basically were not interested in climate change. And then during these remarkable 8 years of Obama, we were aligned and we got a lot done together. The final bit of that last chapter is foreign aid and humanitarian assistance. Again, not many people really focus on this, but hugely important because we're the biggest funders, obviously. And we need to be aligned, coherent in how we spend, fewer and fewer euros and dollars to respond to humanitarian emergencies and developing aid challenges. The last thing I'll say about this is, in 2014 and 15, I lived through our response to the Ebola crisis. And we responded belatedly, but effectively, finally, to deal with this outbreak in Western Africa. And it breaks my heart to see that now in the coronavirus crisis, there's been very little US-EU cooperation. That's something we need to fix. Finally, there's a Brexit chapter, which is a pretty direct chapter, should I put it that way, in which I talk about Boris Johnson at length, someone I've known for a long time, 34 years. I got to know him at Oxford. We debated together. We stayed in touch when he was in Brussels, when he was mayor. I introduced him to John Kerry. I had to describe to the White House what it would be like to deal with Boris Johnson. And I talk at length about the arguments that the Leavers used to justify the Brexit vote. And also the impact of Brexit on EU, US, and also the UK. That's the book. And the last thing, and here I'll close, how could I summarize the book? The book says, look, yes, the European Union has its faults. Yes, it can be messy. Yes, it can operate, only under pressure to take bold steps. But it is still an essential partner. And it brings to the table unique tools, in my view, that enable the US together with Europe to address regional and global challenges. And without Europe and without specifically the EU institutions, it would be a lot harder for us to achieve those goals. And what breaks my heart, honestly breaks my heart under this administration, is the failure to understand that basic argument that if we're talking about reforming the world trading system or dealing with China or dealing with climate change or dealing with Russia with sanctions or even with Iran on sanctions, there's a whole host of areas where the EU actually is an effective partner. Now, hopefully, Luiza, we will, after November, go back to, as I said, 60 years of bipartisan foreign policy and learn some of these lessons and fix some of the damage. With that, I'll close.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for being extremely concise about the book, which is extremely rich. And we could talk for a long time about each of these areas that you've outlined. And one of the things that struck me while reading it is that I think it is very much not just a book about the transatlantic partnership, but it's a book about Europe, in a sense, reminding Europeans of what they have and what they are. Which I think is also important in this moment. But let me turn the floor over to Matthijs van der Plas, who is the Director General for Political Affairs at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I will let you pose the first question to Ambassador Gardner.
Thank you, Luiza. First, a couple of words. First of all, thank you to Tony for writing this very interesting book. Tony is a US citizen with a European spouse. I'm the mirror image of this. I'm a European citizen with an American spouse. My whole family has American passports, including my children, except for me. But I've been coming to the US for many years, every year. It's a country very dear to my heart. So I love being in this session and talking about the transatlantic relationship. Tony, of course, shows in his book that he is a passionate advocate for a strong transatlantic link. And that is what we have in common, because so am I. And for that matter, so is the Netherlands. The Netherlands is one of the member states in the EU with a very strong transatlantic reflex. Probably the only country that had a stronger transatlantic reflex than us were the Brits, and they're out. So we're the standard bearer now. I also feel the necessity of this strong transatlantic link from personal experience. 21 years ago, I was serving at our permanent representation at NATO as a junior diplomat during the Kosovo War. And I saw in that conflict that it was American leadership that led to the solution. America at that moment was for us the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright called it. I felt that very acutely. I also felt a sense of frustration then that we, Europe, weren't able to solve a conflict in our back garden ourselves. We needed America for that. We now live in a different European Union, of course, 20 years later, in a European Union that takes more responsibility. First of all, because that is in line with our ambition to be a geopolitical player. And second, because every US administration expects us to shoulder more of the burden and to take more of the responsibility. Now, this transatlantic community, there are many observers who say that the past couple of years have been very difficult. And as Tony said, he hopes that after November we go back to those 60 years we had before. For me, the transatlantic bond will always be very strong. And why is that? Because it is unique in the fact that it is both a community of values and a community of interests. Those two rarely coincide, but they do when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. And that is a lasting formula for success. We need each other on many issues. Tony summarizes them all in his book. For me, the seven that stand out the most are, first of all, international trade. The US and the EU together need to lead when it comes to international trade. Security would be the second one. The climate challenge, the third one. International development cooperation, foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, the fourth one. We're the two biggest donors. On sanctions, that's the fifth one. And then two very important ones to conclude with, promoting the rule of law and liberal values around the world. We need to partner up on that. And the seventh is both the US and the EU need to be champions for multilateralism. So there's a lot of work we need to do together. We need each other. And it doesn't matter who will occupy the White House after November. We will always be a community of values, a community of interest, and we always have all that work ahead of us, challenges that we need to meet jointly. As my prime minister said in his Churchill speech in Switzerland about a year and a half ago, you don't get to choose your dance partner. You dance with whoever is on the dancing floor. So that's what we will do. Then I come to my question to Tony, and basically, as he says, the European Union is an essential partner for the US. Couldn't agree more. Does he feel that out of this corona crisis that we're going through right now, we will see new opportunities for transatlantic cooperation? And I'll stop there, Luiza.
Thank you very much, Thijs. Ambassador Gardner.
Well, first of all, thank you, Thijs, for doing this. I have a very busy schedule, I know. Really appreciate it. And you made some, I think, some really important points. First, that, and I feel this personally, with the UK out, the Netherlands is going to play even more important role. It was always punching well above its weight in many ways and contributing in ways that I saw every week, not every day when it posts. And not only because of the quality of the diplomatic corps, something I'll also say, not for flattery, but out of sincerity. You know, I was in regular touch with Dutch diplomats on sanctions and other issues. So the country is going to continue to play a really important role in being the Atlanticist, pro-free trade, with a cautious view on regulation, being cautious about overly protectionist direction in Europe. All of that is incredibly important, and of course on climate change. I also view that there is no choice but to have American leadership. And let me also be clear, it's not because the United States always has the answers. We've seen it certainly doesn't, not only in the last few years, in my view, but we've made a lot of very, very bad mistakes over our history. But there isn't, I think, a choice. I don't think even the Chinese want to exercise global leadership. I think it's probably a good thing because we certainly don't share their values. So we need to lead, and we haven't been leading in many key ways, which is unfortunate. Even on this crisis, there was no effort to lead a global response. The first thing that the president was doing is to point fingers. Europe is ceding, infections in the United States. It's China, it's the WHO, it's everybody else. It's not us. And I would have liked to see, and we would have seen under a Biden presidency, an effort to have a global response. There is a slight upside to all of this, and that is that with the United States being a challenge and being a risk, Europe, I think, is now spending more and more time about thinking, how do we protect and project our values in a really tough world? And we've seen it concretely in a number of initiatives that I share wholeheartedly. And using the leverage that the EU does have in many ways, particularly in trade, but also as a regulatory superpower, to protect and project its interests. How are we going to do things differently now under this crisis? Well, as we all know, anyone who's served, in diplomacy or in government will realize the urgent always seems to push out the important. And we're going to be living under this urgent need to respond to this crisis. So we're going to have to, I think, scale back our ambitions in some areas. Trade is one of them. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit. What can we do together with the EU that is pragmatic, practical, operational, quickly? It's not going to be TTIP. We all have lashes on our backs. I suffered. I spent a third of my time on this, and I realized it was too ambitious. It just wasn't going to get done, and now even more so. So what can we do? I'll give you one concrete example. I would like us, if Biden wins, let's say it happens in November, we immediately move to eliminate all tariffs on industrial goods, trade, transatlantically. That should not be too difficult. We already got there, frankly, almost, in the Obama years, and even under Trump, there are discussions ongoing about this. I think it would pass the European Parliament. I think it would have support among European member states. The Commission's in favor of it. I think it would pass Congress. We need to get it done. And we need to get it done to at least build, or we need to push back against skepticism that we can't get anything done in trade. We need to show we can get stuff done. And we need to push back together against the narrative that the answer to this crisis is by building walls and by becoming more self-sufficient and by dismantling supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. And the Netherlands is uniquely placed in Europe to help the narrative that, yes, we may have exaggerated in our reliance on Chinese, Indian, active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, for example, or in PPE, protective equipment. But locking ourselves up in national frontiers and barriers is not the way forward. It would be hugely destructive. So I would like us, if Biden wins, very top of the list, I think we need to show movement on trade and fight against this notion that we should retreat with the national barriers.
Thank you for that. And actually, I'll follow up on what you're saying, because I think one of the most distressing effects of this crisis, in many ways, certainly at the political and geopolitical level, has been, in the logic of emergency, the rush to protect the borders, whether it's immigration restrictions, as we're witnessing right now, and it's definitely distressing, depressing. But also, kind of thinking of how to hoard national supplies, assure supply chains, and limit, in a sense, exposure, limit connectivity, which, as you're saying, is not, apart from not being feasible, it's certainly not a way to go forward. And perhaps, as you're saying, kind of focusing on reactivating trade connections could be a way forward, because it will make, in a sense, certainly European citizens, but not only European citizens, believe that it is possible. I mean, do you think this is something, I mean, beyond, Biden's victory in November, that will be possible in the current political context in the United States? I mean, considering, that the logic of protectionism has been so strong, certainly in the Trump administration, but also in Europe. I mean, if I think about, kind of the pushback that is happening over the past year.
It's going to be a difficult argument to make, you're right, because those arguments in times of crisis fall on fertile soil. People thinking that only the nation state matters, and our first reflex is rarely international, right? But I think we can make the argument. In fact, we're compelled, duty-bound to make this argument. And I think the best place to start, again, is transatlantic, because if you look at the degree of political support for, multilateral response, it surely has to be with our partners. And Matthijs has said it right up front, with whom we share interests and values. It's going to be a lot harder to sit down with, China and other countries where the discussions are going to be much more difficult. So for me, again, back to my book, where do you start? What number do you call? Right? There could be multiple numbers in member states in the EU, but the EU has to be our partner of first resort on these issues. So again, politically, I think it is feasible for us to do these things, whether it's in trade or in security. And not only feasible, it's necessary. And when it's explained to the public, and even on law enforcement and counterterrorism, for global challenges like those and like COVID, it's crazy to think that for global challenges, there's a national response. I think we can make that argument.
Let me turn over to Thijs.
Thank you, Luiza. A couple of remarks on trade. It's also an example where I feel we can work with the current US administration. It was what my prime minister said also in his speech. President Trump is very critical of the way certain multilateral organizations function, especially the WTO. And we can use his criticism of the WTO to work together on reforming the WTO, because we also think the WTO needs reform. So rather than only seeing that as a threat, we should also see it as an opportunity. And I can give more examples of that. For instance, President Trump has been very critical of NATO allies. In the sense that they don't shoulder enough of the burden. And as a result of that, we have seen the defense budgets of many European allies going up. That I also call a gain. So it's not only doom and gloom. Then when it comes to trade, I agree totally with Tony that the US and the EU need to make joint progress on trade. I also agree with him that TTIP was a very ambitious enterprise, and because of the level of ambitions, it ran into trouble. But whatever the EU and the US will be able to agree on trade will always be a global standard. We need to keep that in mind. That works in both our interests. we will have discussions, as Tony pointed out, in the aftermath of the COVID crisis on international supply chains. I think the Dutch economy is one of the most open economies in the world, and we have sung the praise of international value chains for decades because it works for our economy. But as Tony rightly pointed out, maybe now we will come to the conclusion that in some areas there has been an over-reliance on these supply chains, and then in some areas, like the basic ingredients for crucial medicines to fight epidemics, when it comes to ventilators, when it comes to other medical equipment, you might not want to be reliant on countries that are very far away from you. Then lastly, on the climate surrounding trade in Europe, that is in a way no different from the climate that you see in the US. In every country where populist political movements are on the rise, that is accompanied with an anti-trade sentiment. And even parties that are in the political center feel the pressure from that. And to give you an example, right now in the Netherlands, we're in the ratification process of CETA, a trade agreement with Canada. And you would think that this would be plain sailing through our parliament. We have cemeteries here in the Netherlands full of Canadian soldiers who died liberating our country. I mean, everybody in the Netherlands thinks that the Canadian administration is a very benign administration that is close to our heart. And yet, it is not easy to get this treaty ratified in the Dutch parliament. Now, if we can't ratify a treaty with Canada, with who can we? I still have good hopes that we will get it through, both the upper and the lower chamber, but it shows to you that the climate surrounding trade agreements is not necessarily conducive to speedy concluding and entry into force of these things.
Thank you for making those points, because I think that's very much the case, and not just in the Netherlands, but across Europe. And I guess the concern is with a looming economic recession and the economic effects of this crisis, which will, I mean, they're already becoming apparent once. I think popular support will be harder, in a sense, to garner together. I think the question is, okay, it will take a leap of the political and geopolitical imagination, and politicians able and willing to do that, to make these points, to make these arguments, to say that actually trade partnerships are a good thing, that whether transatlantic or otherwise. And I think again, to go back to the book, one of the striking things about it is to show how much of this collaboration, how much of these discussions are already there, have been there for many years, and that there actually is a proximity of interests, and has been for a long time. But to go back to this kind of leap of the imagination, which I think is very necessary to prevent us, from not just, I mean, I don't believe in what some commentators have been writing about recently about the danger of the next populist wave following the corona crisis, because I don't think the populists will certainly, they did not have, and they will not have the answers to confront this crisis. So I don't believe that, but I think for a leap of the political imagination that imagines transnational, not just transatlantic, but collaborative solutions, I mean, we really need a different sort of imaginary. And so I guess I'd like to turn it back to Tony Gardner to see if you have some suggestions for this leap of the imagination. I think your book contains, I think, many interesting points on what has been already done and how it has been possible also in difficult times. I mean, this is a very difficult, exceptional perhaps moment, but we have faced exceptional moments in the past.
So, although I agree with everything that's been said, and Thijs, I agree also with you, on WTO reform, clearly necessary. We had focused on this prior to this administration, but maybe a slight difference of view here. I'm not sure the administration's entirely agreed on whether the WTO should be reformed or whether it should be broken. which is, a lot of troubling examples here about bringing to its knees the appellate body and often working outside the boundaries of the rules-based WTO system on unilateral actions, which lead the way to a free-for-all and a jungle fight. And other countries, not surprisingly, are following the U.S. lead. Saudi Arabia and Russia, just two of them. So yes, absolutely WTO reform. That's why I would have liked to see this administration engage much more with the EU on its proposals, very detailed in its white paper, on what we should be doing together to force the Chinese to reform in certain key areas, whether it's subsidies or state-owned enterprise, the role of state-owned enterprises, market access, and so forth. On defense budgets, absolutely agree. It's not a new debate. It's been going on for decades, and quite rightly, Europe needs to spend much more on its defense, and some of it was already happening as a result of the annexation of Crimea. There, I would just put a slight emphasis. Maybe it's a European point of view here, if I may, but burden sharing should be seen in a more broader context. It's not just about spending on defense. It's about bearing the burdens of being an international good citizen. So it means climate change, where Europe, in fact, has been bearing its burden, probably more than the United States. It also means on foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, bearing its burden, on migration, bearing its burden. So if we're going to talk about shouldering responsibilities, I think one could say to the United States, look, yes, you spend, much more, than Europe, but in many areas you're shouldering less of the burden. The key point here is, how do we actually go about changing people's minds about trade? And that's a super interesting question. Just a short anecdote. I was in Amsterdam during TTIP. I sat down at a dinner. I was invited to a dinner. I was next to someone from the Amsterdam City Council. And that person told me, Mr. Ambassador, you realize the City Council of Amsterdam has just passed a resolution that's calling for Amsterdam to be a TTIP-free zone. And I said, what? A TTIP-free zone? Amsterdam is the creation, of trade, and became rich. The Netherlands became rich thanks to global trading system. You're saying this is a TTIP-free zone. So clearly something went very wrong all over Europe, and we failed to make the case. So how do we fix it? Clearly the social contract needs changing in this regard. Both sides of the Atlantic, US and Europe, failed absolutely in protecting those displaced by globalization and free trade, which are linked, obviously. We talked about it. We both have funds to do it. From what I've seen, and I've done a little digging, they haven't really worked. And interestingly, if you look around in Europe to the national trade adjustment budgets, the UK basically had a minuscule fund that barely paid out anything. I'm talking about millions of pounds, right? Surprise, surprise. There was a direct correlation between those countries most hit by globalization and those parts of the country that voted to leave, and populism. So I would like to see, again, Biden wins. I would like to set up a transatlantic task force of experts to really look about how we do a better job in protecting those who are displaced by globalization and free trade. Otherwise, in my view, we're not really going to win this argument.
Well, I mean, if you think about how important this argument was in strengthening populist forces on both the right and on the left in Europe over the past years, the appeal to those left behind, not just to the people left behind, but also, as you're saying, to the places left behind. I mean, in some ways, it's a very simplistic geographical argument, because it's not that neat of a distinction. I mean, things are much more complex at the local level. But the question of increasing precarization or sense of precarization, that is certainly in the political imaginary linked to globalization, which may be completely misunderstood. But, once more, to return to this, the need for a different political imagination, it is, how do you speak to the European electorates, but also to the US one, to make people believe that a different globalization is possible. A colleague in Vienna, former Austrian MEP, politician Hannes Swoboda, wrote a piece a while ago on the third way, the European third way out of COVID. and kind of using China and the United States as the models not to follow. I mean, these are the questions that he's been asking, kind of thinking of using this moment of emergency, using this moment of crisis, not to just think of a different response to the virus, but imagine different economic futures that cannot work by disconnection, as you're saying. I mean, the idea of building walls, I mean, just as it will only hold for a certain amount of time during a pandemic, you can only keep closure for a certain amount of time. I mean, certainly, kind of going forward, it is not a remedy. And I guess the follow-up question to that would be, how can EU leaders, political, economic, help the United States in this regard? I was reminded of the speech that Barack Obama gave in Hanover, that you're very closely associated with, that in a sense was a moment in which to remind Europeans of who they are, what values made Europe what it is, what values Europe should take forward. So I guess the question would be, how can Europeans remind Americans of who they are in going forward to elaborate any sort of common vision, economic, political, of multilateral collaboration?
Wow. Well, Matthijs is, I'm sure, going to have a lot of interesting views on this. I'll give my just short take on it. The EU has been doing this very effectively. It's been a torchbearer, standard bearer during a difficult time for many of us. And I say that by, because the EU is a creation of rules and laws and multilateral institutions, and clearly lives or dies to the extent that those continue to be respected and upheld, not only in Europe, but worldwide. So it is, Europe has so much at stake in defending this world that we built together. That's how Europe can remind the United States of what's at stake. And what really concerns me, at the top of my list, when I think about risks to Europe, the situation in Hungary for me is actually very concerning. Because if Europe is not capable of really insisting on the respect for basic fundamental rights enshrined in its own charter, then I become rather pessimistic, and I'm an optimistic person, because the EU needs to say this is a zone of shared values, and they need to be respected, not just by applicant members in order to get in, but by those who are in. And so I hope that will now happen. My short answer is that yes, the EU has a fundamental role in upholding these institutions, not just the WTO, but others. Because if we do not live in a rules-based system, and if we are going to the direction of might makes right, bilateral transactional deals, then we should be well aware of the consequences, which are not going to be good for us and even the United States.
And I would unfortunately agree with all of those points. Matthijs, from your experience both in the ministry and also as a diplomat in Europe, how would you add to that? I mean, what would be your perspective?
Well, Lisa, you asked what can the EU offer to the US in this respect. What I see from my experience is every crisis that I've been involved in over the past 28 years, I've been a diplomat. After every crisis, we come to the conclusion that we need more cooperation. Look at the recent past, the financial Eurozone crisis. What was the lesson of that? That the Eurozone building that we had constructed had an incomplete architecture, and we added a lot more cooperation to it. When we had the migration crisis, we realized that the Schengen project and the Common European Asylum System was incomplete, and we added to that building. And I am very confident that also in this Corona crisis, where of course in the initial phases of the Corona crisis, you saw very nationalistic reflexes. National borders all of a sudden became very important. Even European countries started competing for the scarce medical supplies that were around. That was a logical first reaction. But after we have gone through this crisis, I am sure that the conclusion of leaders in Europe will be that we need more cooperation to be ready for the next crisis in this area to fight the next virus outbreak. So in that sense, I'm hopeful. Crises usually lead to more international cooperation. And it's blatantly obvious from this crisis that that is what we need to do. And I think it will happen. Then on the second point, the rule of law, I share Tony's concern completely. My government shares that concern completely. For me, the rule of law, that's the rot in our system, which we cannot afford, because we have, and I mean, rule of law is not the rot in the system, but the violations of the rule of law, of course. Because our European project is built on trust. We send people based on a European arrest warrant to other countries without many questions, in a very light procedure. We trust the judiciary in other European countries, and that's why we're able to do that. And that goes for all our cooperation, because we have pooled so much sovereignty as European nations, and that can only be done if it's underpinned by trust. And violations of the rule of law erode that trust. So it's an issue, it's dear to our heart, and that's why we have been pushing very hard as the Netherlands in bringing about a rule of law peer review system in the EU. Because if we can talk with each other about the internal market, about climate, about migration, about Eurozone, we should also be able to talk about the rule of law. That should not only be the remit of the Council of Europe or the UN or the OCSC. We in Brussels need to talk about that.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question that actually comes from some of our students, and it's a question to both of you as career diplomats. Because one of the, I think, concerns, and this is a concern that appears on both sides of the Atlantic, is a sense of a lack of belief in the role of the diplomatic service. I mean, certainly in the case of Trump's United States, I was speaking to Tony about this earlier, there is the literal gutting of an entire generation of diplomatic staff that will be hard in a sense, you know, to not just to replace, but I think, you know, a change that is already evident, where the sort of American diplomats that Europeans were familiar with are very different from the characters peopling the Trump administration. But one thing that struck me, and that a couple of students brought to my attention here as well, students both at the University of Amsterdam, but also at the College of Europe where I teach, is that young Europeans too no longer, or at least this generation, sees that as somehow a worthy pursuit. And I think that's very worrisome. If we don't have our best students, whether in the United States, being willing either to join the State Department or the diplomatic service more broadly, and similarly here in the EU. What would you say to this, both as, you know, kind of thinking of the need to continue to build a transatlantic partnership that relies very much also on personal connections? And I think Tony's book is very much testament to that.
To you. You want to, Thijs, you want to start?
Yeah, let me start, Luiza. First of all, I'm not that worried. We organize a concours for the Dutch Foreign Service every year, and we have about 30 to 35 vacancies, and we still have 600 young students apply, motivated to join the Dutch Foreign Service. So, and we're always able every year to select an outstanding number of candidates. So, but to those students who are in doubt, I would say diplomacy in the times we're living in is more necessary than ever. And it is a fantastic job. And what makes the job so fantastic for me is that it is a combination of fighting for the interest of your country, but at the same time fighting for an international legal order. and for a just world. It's a combination of those two things which have also always been embodied in American diplomacy. You do both. You work for the interest of your country, and you also work for a better world. And that is something that it has given me pleasure every day since 28 years ago when I joined. And I think it can inspire future generations as well.
Thank you for that, because I think, again, in the era of Trump, I think that belief to think that, we have that kind of common purpose, I think it's more difficult, to see certainly, that being still possible. Tony, would you like to add to this? Because I would be very curious to hear your perspective. I mean, maybe mine is excessively pessimistic from speaking, to colleagues, to students, thinking about what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic, and the loss of a class of American diplomats like yourself.
Well, look, we have lost a lot of people. I know that. I know a lot of people have left the State Department, and they will not be easily or quickly replaced. That's for sure. It will take time. And unfortunately, our system is different from the European system. Of course, we have a civil service as well, but we appoint diplomats on a different basis. And look, I was a political appointee as well, so. I, in a way, benefited from this rather odd system we have. Sometimes the system works, and sometimes the system certainly doesn't work, to put it diplomatically, under both administrations, to be honest, right? But the trouble is that there are a lot of people in the United States, including, unfortunately, those who are in charge of vetting our diplomats, who don't take these positions seriously enough, because as we all know, and Matthijs has seen it throughout his career, we've all seen it, and certainly in moments of crisis like the one we're living in, having people in those jobs can make a difference. That's an obvious point, but it's often missed in the United States. Some people think that these embassies, are there to entertain, not really necessary in the world of digital communications, where you can get information back home in the national capitals, et cetera, et cetera. That's just wrong, right? In moments of crisis, like the Snowden crisis that I walked into, like post-invasion of Crimea, like the European Court of Justice invalidating the safe harbor agreement, and so on. I wasn't, unique by any stretch. You need people at those jobs who actually know what they're doing and can give some degree of leadership to their embassies, who have people who are, civil servants. So I'm not entirely pessimistic, Luiza, in the sense that there are a lot of Americans who are concerned about what's happened to the image of the United States abroad. Not everybody, but a lot of people are, and who want to do something about it. There are a lot of people who now are actively looking for quality sources of information. So every action has a reaction, as I think Matthijs said. There are swings, and then eventually we revert to some sort of a mean. I think if we have a change, people will apply to go to the State Department. They will be committed to doing so. It'll take time to rebuild, but I think we will eventually go back to some sort of a mean. We've had crises before. This won't be the last one.
I would tend and hope to agree with you, and I very much hope that, apart from grand pronouncements, this moment of real difficulty and also fear on the part of not just Europeans but certainly Americans as well, can bring something beyond just the closing of borders and the closing behind national. Matthijs, would you like to add any last questions or comments?
No, I think I don't, Luiza.
And I think, from your position as Director General for Political Affairs in the Ministry here, it was very good also for our students to hear from you that you remain optimistic about both, the importance of the diplomatic service, and and I think actually from both of you, I myself, I tend to be an optimist as well, but I needed to be kind of pushed in that direction by and thinking about the things that we can do together, regardless what will happen with the November elections in the United States. And I think once more, I mean, we spoke only partly about the book, which I encourage everybody to read, because as we were mentioning at the start of this conversation, I think it is not just a book about the transatlantic partnership, but it is very much a book about Europe and what Europe does, what it can do, when it can be. And in this moment, I think we need not only to remember the importance of that partnership and what it has been, and perhaps what it can become again, but also the role that Europe and European leaders and European citizens, in a sense, can play in it. So thank you very much, Tony, for writing this book. And it really comes out at a very appropriate moment. And I'm hoping that many people who are in lockdown will be able to read it, at least in electronic form. Thank you, both of you, very much for taking part in this and starting our series of discussions on responses to the crisis, because even though our conversation today was focused much more specifically on the transatlantic partnership, I think it will be a wonderful lead-in to the series of discussions that will take place now in the weeks to come. So next week, we will talk specifically about the question of healthcare and burden sharing, risk sharing, and the possibility of a concerted European response. And it was interesting that both of you mentioned that. And I hope that your optimism for a kind of multilateral transnational collaborative response will be visible in the months to come. So thank you once more. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you, Thijs. And we look forward to hearing from both of you in the months to come. And we will be following also what is happening on both sides of the Atlantic, because I think the next months will certainly bring some interesting developments. Thank you once more for your participation.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you, my pleasure. Bye.
Bye.